David Montgomery, a billionaire who always had control, now sat powerless in a hospital corridor. His son lay in a coma, and for the first time his wealth meant nothing. Then a small, ragged boy appeared and whispered, "He's going to be okay. You just have to believe." David tried to ignore him until he noticed something strange about the child, a detail too impossible to be a coincidence. Who was this boy, and why did he feel so familiar? Want to know what happened? Watch until the end for this emotional story full of twists. Comment your city and subscribe for more heart-touching stories. David Montgomery sat in the cold hospital corridor, his hands clasped together, fingers pressing hard against his skin. He barely noticed the rhythmic hum of fluorescent lights above him or the quiet murmurs of doctors passing by. His mind was elsewhere, trapped in the space between hope and despair. His 9-year-old son, Theo, lay just beyond those doors, unconscious, fragile, fighting for his life. The doctors had said there was nothing more they could do. It was up to fate now. For the first time in his life, David, a man who had conquered the world of business, who had built an empire from nothing, was utterly powerless. Money could buy the best doctors, the best treatments, the most advanced medical technology, but it could not buy time. It could not buy life. He exhaled shakily, rubbing his face with both hands. Just then he felt it. A touch, a small, calloused hand, resting gently over his own. David jerked his head up, startled. A boy stood before him, thin and ragged, with deep brown eyes that seemed far too wise for someone his age. His dark, messy hair fell over his forehead, and his clothes, tattered, oversized, hung loosely on his frail frame. David blinked, confused. The boy couldn't have been older than 11. He had no hospital bracelet, no visitor badge. He didn't belong here, but then the boy spoke, his voice soft yet steady. "He's going to be okay. You just have to believe." David stared at him, too numb to react. The boy gave a small, knowing smile before stepping back, disappearing down the corridor as quietly as he had appeared. David sat frozen. Something about that child. There was something familiar, and he had no idea why. David barely slept that night. The boy's words echoed in his mind, haunting him like a ghost. "He's going to be okay. You just have to believe." Who was he? And why did his presence linger in David's thoughts like an unfinished melody? By morning, the question still gnawed at him. But as he stepped into Theo's hospital room, his focus shifted. Machines beeped softly. The steady rise and fall of his son's chest gave him a fragile sliver of hope. David sat beside the bed, gently taking Theo's small hand. In his own, his son's fingers were warm but motionless. He whispered, "I'd give up everything, Theo. Just wake up, son." But silence answered him. Feeling the walls closing in, David stepped outside, rubbing his temples. He needed air. That's when he saw him again. The boy, sitting on a bench in the hallway, knees pulled up to his chest, staring at the floor. David frowned. A child. Alone. Unaccompanied. Drifting through a hospital like a ghost. He approached, slowly. "What are you doing here?" he asked. The boy glanced up. "Same as you," he said simply. "Waiting." "Waiting for what?" The boy shrugged. "For something to change." David narrowed his eyes. "Are your parents here?" The boy hesitated. Then with a sad smile he shook his head. "No, it's just me." David's stomach tightened. Just him? Something about the way he said it, calm, resigned, like it was nothing unusual, unnerved him. David sat down beside him, studying his face. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated again, then finally, "Lucas." David nodded slowly. "Lucas, how old are you?" 11. 11. Almost the same age as Theo. David frowned. There was something eerily familiar about this child. The way he spoke, the way his dark eyes carried the weight of someone far older. "Where do you live, Lucas?" A flicker of something crossed the boy's face, so quick David almost missed it. Nowhere. David's throat tightened. What do you mean, nowhere? Lucas exhaled, looking away. My mom died a long time ago. I didn't have anywhere else to go. David felt something sharp twist inside him. An 11-year-old boy, alone in the world. He wanted to ask more, but Lucas suddenly stood up. I should go, he muttered. Wait, David said, standing too. Do you need help? Lucas hesitated, then gave a small, sad smile. You can't help me. Then, just like before, he disappeared down the corridor, slipping through the hospital like a shadow. David stood frozen. A strange unease settled over him. Something about that boy, something about his presence. It tugged at a memory buried deep inside him, and he had no idea why. David couldn't shake the feeling. Even as the hours dragged on, as he sat beside Theo, watching his chest rise and fall, his mind kept drifting back to Lucas. The boy's presence lingered like an unfinished puzzle piece that refused to fit. By late afternoon, David stepped out for coffee, hoping the warmth would steady his nerves. But as he walked through the hospital lobby, his eyes instinctively searched for the boy, and there he was. Lucas sat on the floor near the vending machines, biting into a half-eaten granola bar, his small body curled against the wall. David frowned. People walked past him without a second glance, as if he were invisible. A deep sense of unease settled over David. A child, alone, in a place where no one seemed to notice him. Slowly, he approached. You again, David said. Lucas looked up, chewing. Slowly. You too. David crouched beside him. Lucas, do you really have nowhere to go? Lucas swallowed, his expression unreadable. I told you. It's just me. David exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Do you sleep here? Lucas shrugged. Sometimes when it's cold. David's stomach clenched. A child sleeping in hospital hallways, surviving on scraps. The injustice of it made his chest tighten. But then Lucas spoke again, catching David off guard. I don't think your son wants you to be sad. David's breath caught. He stared at Lucas, something inside him stirring. What? Lucas looked down at his hands. You sit in that chair, head down, looking like you lost everything. His voice was quiet but firm. But he's still here. David felt something tighten in his throat. How do you know that? Lucas tilted his head slightly. Because I know what it feels like to lose someone. David couldn't respond. The weight of those words hung between them. Finally, Lucas stood. I should go. David didn't know why, but the thought of him disappearing into the city alone unsettled him more than he expected. Wait, he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a few $100 bills and held them out. At least take this. Lucas stared at the money. Then he did something David didn't expect. He smiled. Not with joy, but with something almost sad. I don't need money, David frowned. Everyone needs money. Lucas shook his head. Not for the thing I need most. David's hand tightened around the cash. Before he could respond, Lucas turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. David stood there, heart pounding. His mind screamed that this wasn't his problem, that he had his own son to worry about. But something about Lucas refused to let go. Something about him felt too close, too familiar. And then the truth started whispering at the back of David's mind. So quiet, so impossible, he almost didn't hear it, but soon he would, and it would change everything. David had spent his life solving problems, controlling outcomes, bending the world to his will. But now, as he sat in the dim hospital corridor, he felt completely powerless. His son was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do. His thoughts were a storm, swirling between hope and despair. And yet, amidst the chaos in his mind, one thought refused to leave him. Lucas. There was something about that boy, something unsettlingly familiar. Later that night, Unable to silence the unease gnawing at him, David wandered the hospital halls, searching for answers he couldn't quite define. Then he saw him. Lucas was curled up on a hospital bench, his small body rising and falling with each shallow breath. He was shivering, his arms wrapped tightly around himself. His oversized shirt, worn thin from years of hardship, had slipped off one shoulder. David's eyes landed on something small but distinct, a birthmark. His breath caught. It was uncanny, the same shape, the same place, the same birthmark Theo had. For a moment, he told himself it was a coincidence. It had to be, but once the thought took root, it wouldn't let go. He took a slow step forward. His mind raced, pulling memories from the past, moments he hadn't thought about in years. There was no way. And yet, "Lucas," he said softly. The boy stirred, blinking up at him. David hesitated. He wanted to ask. He needed to ask, but he couldn't. Not yet. Instead, he took off his expensive jacket and gently draped it over the boy's small shoulders. Lucas blinked in surprise. "Why did you do that?" "You're cold," David said. His voice was steadier than he felt. Lucas pulled the jacket tighter around himself, but didn't say anything. David sat down beside him. "How long have you been alone?" Lucas shrugged. "A while." The answer sent a fresh wave of guilt crashing over David. Guilt he didn't even understand yet. David studied him, his mind a whirlwind. The resemblance, the way he spoke, the birthmark, and yet he still didn't have the final piece of the puzzle. Not yet, but soon. He would, and once he did, nothing would ever be the same again. David couldn't sleep. Even as the hospital remained eerily quiet, his thoughts roared like a storm. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind replayed the same images. Lucas, the birthmark, the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, the way something about him felt unfinished. David had built his entire life on logic. He didn't believe in fate. He didn't believe in signs, and yet there was something pulling him toward this boy. By morning, he found himself searching for Lucas again, not because he wanted to, because he had to. He found him outside, sitting on a concrete ledge near the hospital parking lot, tossing small pebbles onto the pavement. The oversized jacket David had given him last night still hung off his shoulders. David approached carefully. "Did you sleep at all?" Lucas shrugged. "Did you?" David exhaled, rubbing his face. He sat down beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then David said carefully, "Lucas, how did you end up alone?" Lucas didn't answer right. "Away!" He stared at the ground, his fingers gripping a small stone. "My mom got sick," he finally said. "We had nowhere to go. We slept in shelters, on buses, in parks. Then one day, she just didn't wake up." David felt a weight settle deep in his chest. "She never told you about any other family?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucas shook his head. "It was just us." David's pulse quickened. There it was again, that gnawing feeling that something was missing, something left unsaid. He hesitated before asking the next question. "What was she like?" Lucas's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but a memory slipping through. "She sang a lot, even when she was tired, even when we were hungry. She said music made pain feel smaller." David's chest tightened. Music, a rush of memories, hit him like a wave. A woman's voice, soft and full of warmth, singing while cooking, humming while reading, laughter late at night. Anna, his throat felt dry. "What did she sing?" he asked, barely able to get the words out. Lucas thought for a moment, then softly sang a familiar tune. David's entire body went cold. It was the same lullaby Anna used to hum in the quiet moments when she thought no one was listening. He couldn't fight it anymore. His breath came faster, his hands clenched into fists. His voice, when it finally came, was hoarse, shaking. "Lucas," he swallowed hard, "what was your mother's name?" Lucas hesitated. For the first time he looked uncertain. Then finally he answered, Ana Velasquez. The world stopped. David felt a ringing in his ears. It was real. The impossible, undeniable truth was staring him in the face. Lucas was his son, a child he had never known existed. A child who had suffered alone while David had built an empire, living in luxury, believing his family was whole. His stomach churned, his thoughts spiraling. How had this happened? Before he could process the weight of it, a sharp alarm rang out. From inside the hospital, David's heart lurched. The doors burst open and a nurse ran toward him. "Mr. Montgomery," she called urgently. "It's Theo." David felt like the ground had disappeared beneath him. He grabbed the nurse's arms. "What happened?" His heart rate dropped, she said, breathless. "We're trying to stabilize him, but he's—" She didn't need to finish. David was already running. His legs carried him forward before his mind could catch up. The sterile walls of the hospital blurred as he sprinted down the hallway, his chest tight, his breath ragged. As he reached Theo's room, he froze. Doctors surrounded the hospital bed. The beeping from the monitors was erratic, and Theo, his small body lay limp, his skin pale, his lips slightly parted, as if struggling to take in air. David's entire body turned to ice. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no!" The doctor looked at him with urgency. "His body is shutting down. We need to act now." David felt himself breaking. He had just uncovered the truth about one son, and now he was about to lose the other. David stood frozen at the doorway. His son, his little boy, was slipping away before his eyes. The monitors blared their distress, red numbers flashing in chaotic rhythms. Nurses moved swiftly, their voices sharp, urgent. "His oxygen levels are dropping. Prepare for intubation. Doctor, we're losing him." David's legs refused to move. His chest ached with something deeper than fear, pure, unrelenting helplessness. No, not Theo, not like this. A firm grip pulled him back to reality. Lucas, the boy, was beside him, his small fingers wrapped tightly around David's wrist. His eyes, usually guarded, now held something raw, something David couldn't quite place. "Letty, we see him," Lucas said. David barely registered the words. Everything was spinning. A doctor turned sharply. "Sir, you need to step out. We have to—" Lucas stepped forward. "Please," he said, his voice stronger than before. "Just let me see him." Something in the way he spoke made everyone pause. The doctor hesitated. The room was chaos, but for a fraction of a second, silence pressed against the walls. Then, without really knowing why, David let go. He moved aside, and Lucas walked straight to Theo's bedside. David's breath hitched as he watched. Lucas reached out slowly, hesitantly, until his small, calloused hand rested over Theo's motionless fingers. For a long moment, nothing happened. David could barely breathe. Lucas swallowed hard, then leaned closer, his lips almost brushing Theo's ear. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "Wake up, little brother." The monitors flatlined. David felt his knees buckle. The room erupted into motion. Code blue. Charging to 200. Clear. A jolt of electricity surged through Theo's tiny frame. His body arched, then fell limp again. Again. Clear. Another shock. The line on the monitor remained still. David gripped the bed rail, his knuckles white. His heart was breaking, and then a flicker, a single small unsteady beep, then another and another. David gasped. His breath came in shallow bursts as the beeping grew stronger, steadier. A nurse nearly screamed. "We've got a pulse!" David staggered forward, his eyes locked on his son's face. Theo's fingers twitched, his eyelids fluttered, and then, slowly, painfully, he opened his eyes. David choked on a sob. A wave of relief crashed over him so intensely that his legs nearly gave out. "Theo," he whispered, afraid to believe it, afraid this moment wasn't real. Theo blinked sluggishly, as if waking from the deepest sleep of his life. Then his gaze shifted, not to David but to Lucas, and he smiled. Lucas let out a breath, something between a laugh and a sob. Theo's fingers moved, weak but deliberate. He reached for Lucas's hand. Lucas hesitated for only a moment before. He grasped it tightly. David felt his entire world shift. For years, he had believed his family was whole, but it had never been. Not until now. David stood motionless, his hands gripping the cold metal bedrail. Theo was awake, alive. His son, who had been slipping through his fingers, had come back, and yet, as relief flooded his body, something else crashed into him. Guilt, because this never should have happened. This was his fault. The memory hit him like a wrecking ball. 2 weeks ago. The accident. It had been raining that night. A cold, relentless storm pounding against the city. David had been late. Late for dinner, late for his promises, late for everything that mattered. Theo had waited for him all day, excited to show him something. A school project, maybe. David barely remembered. He had brushed it off, too distracted, too busy on the phone as they left the restaurant. Then came the moment he would never forgive himself for. Theo had let go of his hand. "Dad, look!" David hadn't even turned around. He had still been looking at his phone. And then the screech of tires. A blinding pair of headlights. A sickening crash. David's phone had hit the pavement at the same time Theo's small body. And the image was burned into his mind. The way Theo had crumpled, the way people had screamed, the way time had seemed to stop as he ran toward his son, his heart slamming against his ribs, his son unconscious, broken, barely breathing, and all because David hadn't been paying attention. Present day, the hospital room. David squeezed his eyes shut, pushing back the memory, the shame, the self-hatred. He had spent the past 2 weeks begging fate for a second chance, and now he had it. But not in the way he had expected, because standing beside Theo's bed, holding his hand, as if he had been meant to be there all along, was Lucas, David's lost son. His chest tightened as he looked at the 2 boys, one raised in wealth, the other in struggle. Both of them his, both of them connected by something he couldn't explain. A soft voice broke through his thoughts. "You okay?" David blinked, realizing Lucas was staring at him. He let out a shaky breath. "I don't know." Lucas nodded as if he understood, and maybe he did. Then the hospital room door opened. David turned. His wife, Emily, stood in the doorway. Her eyes were swollen, red-rimmed from days of crying, of waiting, of praying. But now, as she looked at Theo, awake, breathing, hope flooded her expression. "Oh my God," she whispered, rushing forward. "Theo!" She pressed kisses to his forehead, running her hands gently over his hair as if making sure he was real. David watched as Theo gave a sleepy smile, his fingers still wrapped around Lucas's. Emily's face froze. She followed Theo's hand, her eyes landing on Lucas for the first time, her brow furrowed. "Who is this?" David's mouth went dry. Lucas instinctively shrank back, slipping his hand from Theo's. Theo frowned. "Mom, this is Lucas." His voice was weak, but sure. "He's my brother." The room fell into silence. Emily's breath hitched. She looked at David, really looked at him, and in that moment she knew. Her face crumbled. "David!" Her voice shook. "What is he talking about?" David swallowed hard. This was it. The moment that could break everything. The moment where he had to choose. Tell the truth or walk away. David had built entire empires, closed million-dollar deals, made impossible choices, but nothing had ever felt as terrifying as this moment. Emily's eyes locked onto his, searching, demanding answers. Theo's small hand still rested in Lucas's, and Lucas, his lost son, the child he never knew he had, stood frozen, as if preparing to be pushed away. David's chest tightened. He had spent his life believing his family was complete. But the truth had been standing on the streets, alone, abandoned. The weight of the choice crushed him. Would he risk everything, his marriage, the life he had built, to tell the truth? Or would he walk away, leaving Lucas to disappear back into the world, as if he had never existed? He couldn't. Not anymore. David took a slow, shaky breath, and then he spoke. "Emily, he's mine." The words came out raw, broken. Emily flinched, as if he had struck her. She staggered back, one hand gripping the hospital bed, her face pale. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not possible." But David could only shake his head, because it was. He turned to Lucas, his voice trembling. "I didn't know, Lucas, I swear, I didn't know." Lucas didn't move. His eyes flickered, with something David couldn't quite name. Hope and fear colliding. Emily pressed a hand to her mouth. Her breathing was unsteady. "How long have you known?" David hesitated. I wasn't sure. Not until now." Her voice cracked. "And if Theo hadn't said anything?" Silence. David had no answer. Emily's shoulders trembled, but then her gaze shifted to Theo, their son, their miracle. He was still weak, still recovering, but his fingers clung tightly to Lucas's, refusing to let go. Theo's voice was quiet, but sure. "Mom, can he stay?" Emily's breath hitched. Lucas, hearing those words, pulled his hand away. I should go." His voice was small, uncertain, but before he could take a step, David moved. He reached out, not grabbing, not forcing, but offering. "Lucas, if you want—" David swallowed hard. "You never have to be alone again." Lucas stared at the outstretched hand. Tears welled in his eyes. He had been alone for so long, and now, for the first time, he had a choice. His fingers trembled. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he took David's hand. Theo smiled, tightening his grip. On Lucas's other hand, David exhaled, his vision blurring. He had spent a lifetime chasing wealth, power, and control, but none of it mattered. Not compared to this. David sat beside the hospital bed, watching his two sons. For years, he had believed his family was whole, but now, as he looked at Lucas, his son, his blood, his missing piece, he knew the truth. They had been incomplete all along, and finally, they were whole. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft strokes of orange and gold. David stood on the balcony of his home. No, their home now. He watched as Theo and Lucas ran through the backyard, their laughter echoing in the crisp evening air. It had only been a few weeks since that day in the hospital, but everything had changed. At first, it had been difficult. Emily had needed time. Time to grieve the life she thought they had. Time to accept the truth, but in the end, it was Theo who had made the choice simple. "He's my brother," he had said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. And somehow, in the quiet moments, Emily had seen what David had come to understand. Lucas belonged with them. Lucas, on the other hand, had struggled with the idea of having a home. At first, he moved through the house like a visitor, never taking up space, never asking for anything, as if at any moment someone might tell him it had all been a mistake. David had seen it in his eyes, the doubt, the fear, the instinct to run, and so, night after night, he had done the one thing he never imagined himself doing. He had waited for Lucas to believe, waited for him to understand that this time no one was leaving, and slowly Lucas had begun to settle in. He had found comfort in the small things, the smell of pancakes in the morning, the sound of Theo knocking on his bedroom door, the way Emily would absently ruffle his hair as she walked past. And David had found something he never knew he was missing. "Dad!" Theo's voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned just in time to see the boys racing toward him. Lucas stopped a few feet away, hesitating. David smiled. What is it? Theo grinned, nudging Lucas forward. Lucas shifted awkwardly. I was wondering if I could try out for the soccer team at school. David raised an eyebrow. You like soccer? Lucas shrugged. I don't know. Never got to play before. David's heart clenched. How many things had Lucas never gotten to do? He swallowed past the lump in his throat and smiled. Then we'll have to get you some cleats, won't we? Lucas blinked. Really? Really, David said. You're part of this family, Lucas. That means you get to do everything Theo does. No exceptions. Lucas bit his lip, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Then, finally, for the first time since coming home, he smiled. A real, unguarded smile. David felt something warm settle in his chest. For years, he had measured success in numbers, in wealth, in power, but as he looked at his sons, he finally understood this. This was the only thing that had ever truly mattered, and for the first time in his life, he had everything. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, deep inside, don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel and be part of a community that believes in the power of storytelling. Every story we share is crafted to touch hearts, inspire change, and remind us of what truly matters in life. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that could change the way you see the world. Because sometimes, all it takes is one story to make a difference. Will you be here for the next one?